Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, education, business, UFOs, anything that gets our attention. My name is Jesse Mayshark. I am co-publisher and co-founder of Compass at CompassKnox.com, which covers all of the above. I am joined, as always, by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing on this sunny July day, Scott?
I'm doing just fine, but I will have to take issue with you. We are no longer supposed to call them UFOs. The powers that be who are hiding the existence of these things from us call them unidentified anomalous phenomena or unidentified aerial phenomena. So technically we're supposed to call them AUPs.
UAPs.
I'm sorry, UAPs, excuse me. Yes.
Not to be confused with WAPs, which is an entirely different thing that we're not going to talk about here. We are, however, going to talk about UAPs because, believe it or not, there is a Knoxville connection to the search for extraterrestrial life. Also, this week, we are going to have an interview coming up with Chris Thomas, who's the Chief Administrative Officer of the Knox County Regional Forensic Center, to talk about some mortality data that they released this week. We are going to discuss a lawsuit filed by the Tennessee Education Association representing teachers across the state, alleging that the state's restriction on teaching certain, quote, prohibited concepts, unquote, is unconstitutional. Take a quick look at some changes to development rules in the city of Knoxville. And we are going to start out, as we did last week, and probably as we will be doing for the next couple of weeks, as we are in the thick of the City of Knoxville election season, we're going to talk about a couple more of the contested races on the ballots. We wrote about both of these races we're going to talk about on our website, and you can go there and find our in-depth profiles of all of the candidates who are running for these seats.
And that website is?
Our website is CompassKnox.com.
Yes.
You can read it if you're a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber, you can subscribe at that website. And I should note, for those of you who are not subscribers, and you're welcome to listen to the podcast, of course, even if you're not a subscriber, when we come up to the beginning of early voting, we will be moving, as we typically do, all of our election coverage outside the paywall. And so if you really don't want to subscribe, but you really want to read those stories, if you just wait a week or so, those will be moved outside the paywall, and then you can read them and share them and so forth. But we're going to talk about a couple of them this week: the at-large Seat C race for City Council and the sort of unexpectedly interesting municipal judge race. So, Scott, let's start with Seat C. Last week we talked about the at-large Seats A and B races, which both interesting in their own ways. But I think most people would probably agree, most local political observers and election watchers, that Seat C is kind of the most interesting and dynamic of these three at-large races this year. Why don't you walk us through who is on the ballot?
Okay, yeah, it is real interesting. It's the one thing is you've got three candidates, and in the primary, only two go on to the general election. The other two races, one of them just has two candidates. The other one has three, but one of the candidates isn't really campaigning. So those are pretty much, the order of finish might flip, but most candidates.
You can kind of guess who's going to be on the general election ballot in those races.
Seat C is a little different. There is an incumbent, Amelia Parker. She is a progressive. She's very outspoken. She is often at odds with Mayor Indy Kincannon's administration. She's often on the short end of 7-1 votes on council about things. She, for instance, didn't approve the budget, so she didn't vote for. She didn't vote for that. Things like that. Although she has had some legislative successes, I don't want to make it sound like she's a failure as a legislator. She's not.
Right, which she's really been emphasizing, I feel like, in her campaign. She's been kind of trying to push back against this idea that she's too combative and kind of doesn't get anything done. And she's been saying, look, I am actually getting things done. I'm just a forceful advocate.
Well, yeah, and one of the things, and this is kind of an aside that's interesting about Parker, and is actually kind of refreshing, is that on her campaign website, she lists the ordinances and resolutions that she sponsored or co-sponsored that passed, which you would expect. She also lists the ones that she sponsored or co-sponsored that didn't pass. So she put her successes and her failures out there, very transparent, something you don't see very often. So that was something on her website. But anyway, she is running. She has a very passionate support base, which is very important in a low turnout race. And as we all know, city races tend to be low turnout races. So she is running. She's got two challengers. One of them is Tim Hill. He is a developer. He's the chair of the planning commission. He serves on the sports authority board. He's kind of taken a more traditional route to running for city council. Much more of an establishment type candidate, has a huge lead in fundraising. He's raised $1 gazillion and he's spending it. And so,
by gazillion, we mean like over $150,000, which is a lot for a city council race.
Oh yeah. Most city council races are in the lower five figures, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. And neither of, as of June 1st, which is the beginning of the next reporting.
July 1st.
I'm sorry, July 1st, the next reporting period. He had it wasn't quite 150 in the bank, but Parker and the other candidate, Matthew Best, only had I think combined they might have had a little bit over 10,000. It was a very small amount. The Parker actually raised a little bit more during that quarter, but it's a minuscule amount compared to Hill. And so he's got that advantage, and he's got videos on Facebook. He can print more signs and mail out more mailers and all that than anybody else. So it's a very she has the advantage of the incumbency. He has the advantage in fundraising there. The third candidate is Matthew Best. He is the executive director of the Change Center. He's young. He's energetic. He too is he's more of a center progressive. He has the backing of former mayor Madeline Rojero, Reverend Harold Middlebrook, a lot of the kind of traditional progressive heavyweights in the city.
Sort of the Democratic establishment to the extent that we have one.
True. And now, he, like Parker, is woefully behind in fundraising, although he really hadn't made a big push by the end of the second quarter. So when the next financial reports come out, we'll be able to see how much he's been able to do. His candidacy has also been kind of interrupted because his wife just gave birth to a boy. Mm-hmm. In fact, the day before our profile in this race ran, he announced on Facebook that he didn't come out and say it, but there was an announcement on Facebook that indicated that that they had a baby born, and since then people have been
congratulating
him. Yes, congratulations to Matthew, and so anyway, that's kind of taken up a lot of his time recently, as you might imagine. But he's originally from Memphis. He's a UT grad, youth minister for most of his career. And now, like I said, he's at the Change Center. He comes from a political family. His mom was an elected judge in Memphis. He worked on Harold Ford's congressional campaigns, and so and his mom's campaigns. So he knows a little bit about politics. He is very much when you talk to him, he has the cadences and the eloquence of a preacher, as you might imagine, since he was a youth minister. So it's an interesting dynamic with all three of them involved in this.
Well, and I think one way to think about it, because of course these are nonpartisan races, as we always say. At the same time, people's partisan affiliations and or ideological leanings do come into them for sure. And in this race, we really have, as you said, with the incumbent, Amelia Parker, is very much a progressive standard bearer. You know, you could kind of say she's the most, she comes from kind of an activist background. She was supported last time and will be supported this time by the city council movement and people affiliated with it, which is very much a grassroots progressive effort. Her election last time was notable, was really kind of surprising. She was the first ever Black candidate elected to a citywide office in Knoxville. Like that's significant, and a fairly left-wing Black woman candidate elected to city council in Knoxville. So it was a real achievement for her to get elected. And as you say, she's had sort of an inherently contentious tenure, which I think probably her listing the things that she proposed that didn't pass, she probably, I'm sure, doesn't even consider those failures. She considers them cases where she was kind of fighting for what she thought was right, and the rest of council did not go along with it, but she's still proud of having made the efforts. And obviously with Tim Hill, I mean, we say he's a developer, but I think it's important to note he's an urban developer mostly, like most of what Tim Hill does, and I think this is why he's running in the city. Most of his work is in the city. He's been doing lots of redevelopment work in and around downtown. So when we say developer, he's not the developer in the mold of people who are going out and, you know, carving up farm fields in Coreyton or whatever.
Yeah, in fact, when I talked to him for that article, one thing that didn't make it in was that he said that they don't take on any projects outside of 30 minutes from the office, which is on North Shore. He said he knows the city market, and that's what he does.
Right. Well, and he is also apparently, as far as we can tell, a Republican, and he's not explicitly running as a Republican, unlike the slate of candidates who ran a couple of years ago, but he's been active in the Republican Party. A few of the things he's done are kind of being used against him by his opponents or people affiliated by them, including, helping to host Ron DeSantis on a visit to Knoxville, making campaign contributions to people like Elaine Davis, sort of the more far right of our local candidates. And so in the city, which tends to vote Democratic overall, some of those things are kind of being wielded against Hill by various people to say, that he's a rich white Republican developer. I mean, that's kind of what his opponents are trying to paint him as. He's painting himself as a guy who knows how to do business in the city and can kind of represent the interests of economic development in the city, and that, he would say he's very committed to trying to solve some of the long-running socioeconomic issues in the city, but coming from a business perspective. Yeah,
he says that basically, whatever his thoughts are on national politics, you don't really apply here. He's very He says he's very pragmatic and that he's a problem solver, and that's what the approach he would take to city council. One thing that he also on the planning commission, like I said, he's the chair. He he often exhorts his fellow developers who come before them to work with neighborhoods, get neighborhood buy-in before they come to the planning commission with subdivision proposals or new development proposals, anything like that. He's a real proponent of that. Doesn't mean if they don't do it, he will vote against them. He's he is a developer, and he thinks that like everyone on the planning commission is pro development. They might think of smart development in different ways, but so that don't get me wrong, he is pro development, but he does advocate for that quite a bit. So I think he will point that out as being an example of, well, I'm a pragmatic guy, and that's a pragmatic thing to do if you're a developer, and so and it ends up being good for the neighborhoods. So.
And then Best seems to be kind of looking for, and or has maybe been recruited by and encouraged to run by people in that kind of, like you said, center left, center progressive establishment lane that would maybe be shared by, for example, Mayor India Kincannon. And so for people who are broadly supportive, say, of the Kincannon administration, which, as you say, Amelia Parker has often not been, but would like to vote for a more progressive candidate and maybe not a Republican developer, Best is sort of like opening up that lane. And like you said, it's really unpredictable which two of those three get through into the general election. And depending on which two get through, we could be looking at sort of very different races when it comes to November.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can have, there's the chance that you have two progressives running. There's a chance you have a developer running against a very progressive reform candidate, which is, Parker's a reform-minded person, so that, or you could have someone who's kind of center-right developer running against a kind of center-left progressive. It's kind of the combinations are endless, and you can see just about all of those playing out. Mm-hmm. It's like I said, it's going to be a low turnout race. You've got Parker with a very passionate base who will vote and will turn out for her. You've got Hill, who's got a broader reach, the ability to reach more voters in more places than any of the other candidates, and then you've got Best, who can be seen as an alternative to both of them.
Right.
And so it's going to be an interesting dynamic, and as said, coming into this, it's probably the most interesting of the council races.
And we are certainly making no predictions in that one. We will wait to see what happens, like everybody else. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the municipal judge race, which is mostly interesting in the fact that we have a municipal judge race, because I think, as we've talked about on here before, there are no term limits for the city judge, which is a part-time job. Here's mostly low-level cases, speeding tickets, parking tickets, city code violations. I think the maximum penalty, apart from court fees, that you can get on most charges brought to city court is like $50 for most city.
It's gone up, but it's over 100, but it's not. I think it's 129, 126, something like that.
But these are all misdemeanor charges.
These are all misdemeanors, and like I said, violations of city code. They don't do murders, they don't do rapes, they don't do armed robberies, things like that. These are overgrown lots. These are speeding tickets and parking tickets, like you said. So, which doesn't mean that they're insignificant, of course, but
no, it's one of the courts, and several of the candidates running have said this, is one of the courts that actually interacts with the greatest number of people, because lots more people get speeding tickets and parking tickets than get arrested on felony charges and so forth.
Yeah, and one thing is, like, when KPD officer pulls you over, they can write you a state ticket or a city ticket. Well, of course, they're going to write a city ticket, so but they've got the option. They can send you to state court and you'll pay a lot more. So
but that money won't stay with the city.
It won't stay with the city, so they tend not to do that. It deals with a lot more people and quite frankly, a lot of people with lesser means.
Mm-hmm.
So
so it's been held, this seat, since 1986 by the same incumbent, John Rawson, who was initially appointed to fill an unexpired term and then has won 9 straight elections and has only had opposition in 2 prior elections out of all of those. And I think in both those cases, he only had one person running against him. This year, for whatever reason, who knows, things get out there in the legal community. People sense an opening. There are 3 other candidates running against him, all of them lawyers, which is really the only requirement for the job. You do have to be a licensed attorney and
30 years old.
And at least 30 years old. And so all 3 of them meet that, although one of them only by a year. Yeah. So the youngest, going from youngest to oldest of the challengers, Tyler Cavanis, is only 31 years old. He's also the one who has raised the most money of the challengers, and actually in the quarter leading up to July 1st, he outraised Rawson. So he's, he may not be a familiar name sort of citywide, but he is somewhat known within the legal community. He's worked for the public defender's office. He's been in private practice. He's worked with a lot of prominent attorneys in Knoxville, and I guess has sort of been, flagged as a young up-and-comer by some number of people who are supporting his candidacy. Then also running is Andrew Beamer, who is 38 years old, again, an attorney in private practice, does a range of work as lawyers in private practice tend to do. He works in juvenile court in Blount County, and then other than that, doesn't do as much criminal work in Knox County, more civil work. And then and he's 38 years old, and then attorney Mary Ward, who I believe is 56. She's in her mid-50s. She's been an attorney for 30 plus years, and again, she actually worked as a prosecutor for a short time in Georgia before moving to Knoxville. She works in criminal defense and civil cases as well. Of the 3, she's the one who most touts her trial record. Like, she is a trial lawyer. She likes being in court. All 3 of them have some amount of experience in city court, although not a lot, because most people who go to city court don't hire lawyers. But they have all practiced there on and off, and are familiar with it. And kind of, it's interesting in these judges' races because A, of course, they are nonpartisan, but B, judges, unlike most other people running for office, can't really advocate for policies so much. That's not what they're there to do. They're there to impartially administer justice. And so that's kind of the most they can really promise is, I will run a fair courtroom where everybody gets a fair hearing. And so they all kind of say that. And then all 3 of the challengers, in talking about Rawson, nobody really directly criticizes his record per se. They all say he's done a good job. He's served a valuable service to the people of Knoxville. But it's time for a change. Rawson is 75 years old. This would be his 10th term. He would be pushing up on 80 by the time he finishes it. And Rawson basically says, well, I understand that, but I feel great. I'm in great shape. Yeah. I like this job. I know how to do it. And, I've been elected 9 times. Obviously, people have been satisfied with how I'm doing it. So why not stick with what works, basically, is his argument. And, there is a sort of slightly subtextual layer where all 3 of the challengers are kind of presenting themselves as being more progressive than Rawson, more concerned about kind of social justice issues, how the court might, for example, work more closely with defendants to try to make sure that they're not burdened with court fees and fines that they're just not going to be able to pay, which can then lead to them losing driver's licenses and those kinds of things. Kind of trying to think a little more proactively than they say the court has been doing about not just how to dispense with the cases and administer them as they come through, but, take the extra step and pay attention to the circumstances and needs of all of the different people who come through, refer them to, services if they need them, and so on and so forth. So I think there's, and there's been talk about Rawson gave introductions for some speakers at a Donald Trump rally back during the 2015-2016 presidential campaign. Rawson says he wasn't there to give an endorsement, which judges are not really supposed to do, but he was just asked to be an official voice to introduce some people, and that that was all it was. But again, I think sort of the slightly sub rosa argument being made there is that Rawson is an old white Republican, and we don't even know for sure that he's a Republican, but that's sort of the way it's being presented, and that Knoxville is not a city of old white Republicans, which is true, and so that the other three combined are all kind of saying, hey, we're younger, we're more in tune with the city as it is, and with the concerns of people in the city. How all that shakes out. Another wrinkle in this judge's race is if, like the mayor's race and unlike the city council races, if anybody gets more than 50% in the primary, they win outright and there will not be a general election. So Rawson's best bet here as the incumbent is to clear that 50% just on the basis of name recognition, people being happy with him and so forth in the primary, and then not have to worry about an opponent in the general. If the other three candidates combined get more than 50% in the primary, whichever one of them gets the most, then we'll be up against Rawson in the general. And then that's where you get into, that would be a real referendum on kind of, do people think it's time for a change?
Yeah. And one thing, when you go to that, the Knoxville Bar Association doesn't endorse candidates, but they do poll their members, and they did a survey of the members, and this is one of the challenges that the candidates face. Rawson was, and it's do you recommend or do you not recommend, in varying degrees of that. But
right, as individuals, not picking one above the others, but just as an individual.
Yeah.
Do you recommend or not recommend?
Would you recommend Rawson? Would you recommend Ward? Would you recommend Cavanis? Would you recommend Beamer? Rawson by far had the most who would recommend him. And the problem with the other three is that even among attorneys, there were a substantial number who didn't know them well enough to make a recommendation. I think that was
majorities for all three of them.
Actually, it was majorities for all three of them. So if that is the case within the legal community, then it's probably the case in the general public as well. And
right, where a combined 75% or so did recommend Rawson.
Yeah, and so that's at play in there. And yeah, you're right. I mean, there was also a candidate forum at Messiah Lutheran Church in West Knoxville last week,
which you moderated.
Well, I was there
very skillfully.
I tried. You weren't there.
I watched a little on Facebook.
But they brought up things like fees and costs and things like that, and Rawson did kind of defend the way that he has approached that, and trying to keep people from getting into deeper financial holes by this. But that was a big point of discussion, and of course, term limits did come up. The candidates were asked if they think term limits ought to be extended to judges. All three of the challengers said, well, and it's not up to us, and it's not. It would require at least a charter change for this to happen. But they said, each of them said that Ward said, I'll basically serve 2 terms. Cavanis said up to 3. Beamer didn't put a number on it, but he said he could not imagine. He wanted to retire at some point, so he couldn't imagine serving forever. Obviously, all those trying to put themselves in contrast with Rawson, who said, of course, as you would expect, I respectfully disagree with you guys. And he was pointing out that with judges, the more experience you have, the better, that he is a better judge now than he was last week and last year, last decade, that kind of thing. So,
in the Reagan era,
back when the horseless carriage, no, I'm kidding. Sorry, John, don't mean to make that much big of a deal of it. Anyway, but as you said, this thing could be over in the primary. But if it does go on, it'll be basically, I think the question would end up being whether it's raised by the other candidate or not. Is Rawson, should he retire?
Right. Are people ready for a change?
Yeah.
All right. We can probably hit on this one relatively quickly, but the city of Knoxville did approve a couple of changes to its development rules this week, which were both two specific things that we've actually talked about here before. So why don't you catch us up on those?
Yeah, real quick, because we have gone over it. One was they did away with what's known as the 50% rule, which it governs redevelopment of commercial property. Prior to last Tuesday, if you wanted to redevelop commercial property, if the renovations were valued at more than half the property value, you had to go in and redo your parking lot up to the newest standards, which includes landscaping requirements that are and basically all of these. We're talking about redevelopment, so these properties already have parking lots that aren't, for the most part, in compliance with this. So that adds to the development cost. And, you might say, I'll cry me a river, but what that means in practice is that redevelopment of buildings that are lower value hit that threshold a lot sooner than buildings at higher value, which means if you go out, say, in West Knoxville, redevelop a building, it's much less likely you're less likely to hit that threshold, and you can leave your parking lot as is. If you go to some place like East Knoxville or North Knoxville, where the property values are lower, then you hit that threshold higher, or quicker, and then you have the added cost. Not only are you trying to redevelop property in an area that's been underinvested in recent years, but now you've got the added expense of having to redesign and rebuild your parking lot as well. And people have just walked away from projects. And so the city basically, council did away with that.
So now basically those new parking standards are only going to apply to actual new construction, not redevelopment.
For the most part. I mean, you can, there's some, without getting too far in the weeds, because we did say we wanted to handle this quickly, but that is essentially the case. The other change, excuse me, the other change is a proposal that Councilwoman Seema Singh brought forward. It was a very targeted request to ask the Planning Commission to review and make a recommendation to Council about making it easier to build duplexes in RN2 residential zones, which cover about 20% of the residential area in the city. They're traditional neighborhoods, little smaller lots. Think the neighborhoods closer to downtown, like the ones we live in, Bell Morris and Oakwood Lincoln Park and those areas. Most of those properties are RN2, and what this would do would be it would allow you to build a duplex on those properties without going to Planning Commission for approval of the use. Now, in the current rules, you have to go to the Planning Commission to get that approval if you want to build a duplex. They routinely give it. So what you're doing is basically requiring people to go in and file, paperwork and pay fees of anywhere between $400 and more than $1,000, depending on the size of the lot, to get something that's going to be approved almost no matter what. It's almost a given that it's going to be approved. So that would remove that. like I said, it doesn't do that yet. It's going to Planning Commission. They'll make a recommendation, come back to City Council, and it's a way to address the missing middle housing that we've talked about. The housing options between single family houses and big apartment complexes. Now, this was interesting because Singh went ahead and put this forward. The Kincannon administration is working on a slate of options. They're taking a different approach than Singh is on this one. Singh's approach applies to every property in the city that's zoned RN2, all across the city. The Kincannon administration is going to do more than just address duplexes, but it's going to be in more targeted geographic areas that are next to commercial nodes where walkability is encouraged and more likely, and so that have higher density there. This is all about increasing density without raising the hackles of too many neighborhood groups.
Right, because existing neighborhood associations and residents are often very wary of anything that brings more density into existing neighborhoods.
Right. So, and one thing, this did get amended because Councilwoman Lauren Ryder and Singh welcomed the amendment. Is also asking MPC to look, or MPC still doing that. The Planning Commission to consider other impediments that were raised by a consultant to these types of housing, and those include setbacks from property lines and the size of a building footprint and that sort of thing. So the Planning Commission's charge now is to take a look at the pros and cons of allowing people just to build duplexes, whenever they want, who live who have property in those zones, and make a recommendation to council. I don't know how long it will take Planning Commission to do that. Probably a couple of months. So before the end of the year, there probably will be a recommendation on that.
Plus, also something coming from the administration.
And something coming from the administration. And as we've talked about before, our Bentley Marlowe has proposals before the Planning Commission to address the same thing. So there's a huge rush to address that missing middle housing.
And we did talk with Councilwoman Singh about her proposal and this kind of whole issue on last week's podcast. So if you missed that, you can go back and hear more about all of it there. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about this interesting lawsuit that was filed this week by the Tennessee Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the state. It is an affiliate of the National Education Association, and it has local affiliates across the state, including the Knox County Education Association. And interestingly, the current president of the TEA, the State Level Education Association, is Tanya Coates, who is a Knox County teacher and former president of the KCEA, our local association here. So we have local representation at the top of the TEA right now. And they filed a lawsuit this week against the state, and this was over a bill. We've talked about a couple of bills before that the state has passed in the last few years, having to do with restricting teaching of certain topics, mostly revolving around race and gender and history, in both K-12 schools and in higher education. This lawsuit is directed at the bill that affects K-12 schools, as you would expect, being brought by public school teachers. And basically, it's arguing that the way this law is written, because it lists 14 prohibited concepts that are not allowed to be promoted or included in instruction. And they are things like you can't teach people that anybody is inherently inferior or superior because of their race or gender or ethnic background. You can't teach that certain people are inherently racist or sexist or oppressive just because of their race or gender or background. And, if you read the thing with these laws, which have been passed in several states across the country now in just the last few years, and which really came out of a political reaction to all the racial justice protests in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, there's sort of like a conservative backlash against all of the talk around racial justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at, universities, schools, businesses, and whatever. That's really what these laws were reacting to. If you look at what the laws say, and of course this was said by critics at the time, you'd say, well, sure, like teachers shouldn't be teaching people that anybody is inherently good or bad because of their race or gender. But if you dig into them a little bit, you see that a lot of this is bound up with how people feel at the back end of receiving information in a classroom. And so there was this anecdote that was widely used, never verified as far as I know. I have not been able to find anybody actually naming the person involved in this. It was talked about at a school board meeting in Williamson County and then became part of the statewide discussion and was cited repeatedly in passing this law by Representative John Reagan, Republican of Oak Ridge, who was the sponsor of it in the House, that there was a 7-year-old girl, 7-year-old white girl at Williamson County School who came home from some lesson, who knows what, if this really actually happened, having to do with, I don't know, racial history in America, Martin Luther King. It's never said what she was actually told in a classroom, but she came home allegedly crying and telling her mother she felt ashamed to be white. And that was really the kind of galvanizing impetus here in Tennessee. This was the thing that was cited. And so the law is kind of based on you kind of can't make anybody feel bad, which of course is a very subjective thing.
And impossible.
And impossible to know kind of on the front end of how anybody's going to react. And so this lawsuit filed by the TEA this past week basically says, we don't know what this law means, and it's scaring the heck out of teachers across the state who are afraid to teach things that they are actually required by state curriculum to teach: the history of slavery, the history of segregation, the history of sexual discrimination in the United States, that women were second-class citizens until, 1920. The history of the difficulties that different immigrant groups faced over time, the discrimination that they faced, Japanese internment camps. I mean, we have a lot of things in the displacement of Native Americans throughout our history. We have a lot of things in American history that you could say are, sort of difficult to talk about, maybe for some people, uncomfortable, maybe for some people to talk about, but they happened. And they are actually in the state guidelines. You are supposed to teach them. Now, the law does include exemptions for teaching what it calls the impartial teaching of history, the impartial teaching of controversial subjects. It doesn't define impartial. It doesn't define controversial. It doesn't define what promoting or including means. And so, the lawsuit says that any attempt to talk about, say, slavery, to talk about really racial history in America overall in an honest way, in a factual way, is going to include the need to talk about, well, there were people, even if you want to frame it as purely a historical thing, that nobody in America anymore is racist. Even if you accepted that framing, you would still have to say, we went through a long period of our history where it was explicitly taught that some races were superior to others, some genders were superior to others, all of these things. These were things people very strongly believed and legislated around and whatever. And those are concepts you have to include in talking about history. And so basically the argument of the lawsuit is that this is making it impossible for teachers to, it alleges that this is a violation of their 14th Amendment rights to due process because it subjects teachers to potential penalties up to and including, fines and losing their teaching license in the state of Tennessee. It also subjects school districts themselves to the loss of state funds. But without any kind of due process, because there really aren't any clear standards about what any of these terms mean, how teachers can know even if they're trying to comply with the law, whether they're complying or not. And that so much of it seems to hinge on other people's subjective reactions, students in the classroom or their parents, that one lesson, you might have been teaching the same lesson for 10 years and nobody's ever complained, and then you teach it and like one student complains, and suddenly your career's in jeopardy. And that is not just a hypothetical. According to the lawsuit, it cites a case out of Blount County last year after this law was passed, where a book that was published in 1975 called Dragon Wings, that has been part of sort of standard middle school reading lists for almost 50 years now, but that has to do with the experiences of a Chinese immigrant boy who moves to San Francisco in the early 1900s, which include racial discrimination, which, that was part of the experience. If you were a Chinese immigrant in San Francisco in the early 1900s, that was part of your daily life. This book actually generated a complaint, and it led to not just the teacher, but the curricular specialist, like the veteran administrator in Blount County school system. Just because this book was included, it launched a local investigation that she had to go through to kind of lay out all of the reasons this book, which, among other things, is part of state-approved reading materials. Why this book was actually okay, didn't violate the law. The local investigation did find that, okay, yes, you didn't violate the law, but then the parent appealed it, which you can under the law, to the state. So then the administrator had to go through, again, this is all one parent, one student filing this. This same administrator then had to go through a whole state hearing. It said she had to compile 250 pages of documents. And again, the state did end up clearing her. But what the lawsuit alleges is that the net effect of all of this is basically to make teachers very afraid to touch any of these subjects at all. And among the plaintiffs in the suit are 4 educators, and one of them says in the lawsuit that she herself has actually removed things that are part of the state curriculum, but she's removed them from her own lesson plans for fear of jeopardizing her career. And so, of course, critics of this law all along have said that that was the real point of the law, that the point was not so much necessarily to lead to a bunch of teachers getting fired as to scare teachers out of talking about actual history, actual racial, gender history, and so forth in the United States. So the law is filed in federal court. It's an interesting lawsuit. We have it up on our website. You can read it there. And it'll be interesting to see. There are other laws like this. Florida has one called the Stop Woke Act, which has already been partly blocked by a federal judge. In that case, on First Amendment grounds, freedom of speech grounds, not on the 14th Amendment grounds that this suit is pursuing. One other thing to mention about this suit is that among the lawyers involved, besides the Tennessee Education Association's own lawyers, is a law firm called the Free and Fair Litigation Group, a new group out of New York City. And we've seen this on both the left and the right. There are all these sort of political, ideological, legal organizations out there filing lawsuits in states across the country. This is a liberal group of New York attorneys who have banded together to basically try to stand up for what they say are constitutional liberties that are being infringed, mostly in red states, basically.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, the anecdote about the young girl. I mean, you kind of sit there and go, well, that could have been a teachable moment,
right?
For the parents or whoever, because then you can talk about slavery, you can talk about things, and you can also talk about how the responsibility of someone now for what what their ancestors did then. I mean, I have ancestors who owned slaves.
I do too,
and,
as it happens.
I'm don't think that I'm responsible for that necessarily.
But I also don't feel any need to justify it.
I don't feel any need. Yeah. I mean, justifying it's not the point. I mean, the point is, okay, that's what happened then. Your responsibility now is what it is now, and your responsibility as a citizen is this, and understanding what happened then and why this is your responsibility now is important, and those kind of conversations, are much less likely to happen if this law, as this law, goes into effect, if you listen to the teachers.
Right. If teachers are really afraid to raise these things.
Yeah.
And right. I do think that it's notable and in no way a coincidence that, this law was passed in Tennessee in 2021, and the same was true across the country, 2021, 2022. We saw these laws. The timing coming after the racial justice protests in 2020 is just clearly not coincidental. And we see this throughout American history, especially when it comes to racial issues, where anytime there's kind of a move toward, efforts on what you would call, I guess, the racial justice side of the equation, there is often a backlash. And that, again, critics of the law would say that the goal here is not just to restrict the teaching of history, but as you say, to restrict the discussion of ongoing inequities in our current modern society and the ways that those are maybe derived from the legacies of, our racist past, and to kind of try to shut that down, and maybe so people don't feel like they really need that, that they need to do anything, basically. So that's the argument that's out there. Who knows what the courts will make of these things? We've moved into a very interesting phase, I feel like, in our political history now, where so many things are being thrown onto the courts to try to sort out ideological fights, policy fights. There's a whole argument about whether that's really the appropriate role of the courts, from either the left or right perspective. But it doesn't seem like something it seems like something we're going to see more of rather than less of, and this is the latest version of that. Okay, moving on from such earthly concerns, Tim Burchett, UFOs. Lots of talk this week on the national level. Burchett helped lead a hearing in Congress. This has been a long time kind of fascination of his, what the government knows or doesn't know about UFOs or UAPs, and what they are covering up, maybe what evidence they're sitting on. And so Burchett was part of this hearing, and then he was also on several sort of national news outlets talking about it. So what did we learn about UAPs this week?
They're out there, according to Burchett. They did hold this hearing. It did get a lot of national attention because, quite frankly, this isn't the typical subject of hearings in Congress. It was a subcommittee hearing, the Oversight Committee, and they had 3 witnesses who came forward. He gave testimony about various things. They had 2 pilots who gave Navy pilots who gave testimony about encounters they had, things that they had seen when they were out. And the star witness was a guy by the name of David Grush. He worked at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is a really fancy way of saying intelligence derived from mapping data and related things. But
it has that word spatial in there that makes it sound like he's involved in extraterrestrial exploration.
But he gave testimony that during his work there, he became aware of things like crash sites, UFO crash sites. The most kind of titillating thing about it was that there were non-human remains that were recovered from some of these sites, and that he hinted that some people may have been killed who knew about this. I mean, it's a very
kind of X-Files.
Very X-Files thing. Now this was all testimony. There really isn't any way to really collaborate.
He didn't provide evidence.
No, there was no evidence provided. Everything's classified. And that's kind of that's a pretty fertile field if you want to allege a cover up, because if you there's classified information, but Burchett thinks that the American people need to know what's going on, and which I'm pretty much in favor of the American people knowing what their government's up to, and he is demanding more transparency. He thinks that the Pentagon and the intelligence community have been engaged in a decades-long cover-up of technology, essentially, that is beyond our capabilities now, and that this vast cover-up is ongoing and will continue to go on. But he and his like-minded colleagues in Congress and these whistleblowers will keep pressing for answers. He makes no bones about his disdain for the intelligence community. In fact, he called the leadership of the Pentagon during one of his media appearances. He called them war pimps. So I mean, he's really he really gets worked up over the UFO issue, and he is. They are going to ask Speaker Kevin McCarthy to set up an actual committee to continue looking into these allegations of government cover up of encounters with UFOs.
And we should say that what there is evidence of are exactly those encounters. And over many years, there are many documented cases of military pilots and also commercial pilots encountering various kinds of craft of one sort or another in the air and not knowing what they were, and seeing things that, sort of behaved in ways that conventional human-made flying machines don't do. Of course, there's a whole sort of more, I guess, down-to-earth side of this, where you have people saying, well, sure, there's things up there, but they are probably government aircraft of one kind or another. They're probably things being put up there by, China or Russia, or, maybe it's secret American technology that people are running into that, is classified itself. And that's why it's not being revealed, because some of these things are like our own weapon systems or whatever, that like there's explanations. There have been encounters, but there are potential explanations for them that are not extraterrestrial. And
counter arguments about that. I mean, Burchett talked about how you mentioned these are experimental aircraft that the United States is going, and he said, well, why didn't they warn these pilots who saw them that they were these experimental craft were out there, so that they wouldn't run into wouldn't collide with them or things like that, and if this technology does exist, we could use it to enhance our own military power, and there's all kinds of things that you can argue. And I can't remember off the top of my head now if it was the Pentagon or one of the intelligence agencies that sent out a statement that basically said, there are all kinds of reports of things like this, but we've never found any evidence of alien encounters. So one thing is that that Burchett has vowed to continue searching for the truth.
The truth is out there. Okay, well, turning back to more terrestrial and frankly grimmer considerations, the Knox County Regional Forensic Center, which serves as the chief medical examiner for Knox County and Anderson County, and also provides autopsy services for another 21 surrounding counties, issued 2 reports this week. This is basically mortality data. They put these out every year, one specifically looking at drug-related deaths, and the other one kind of giving an overview of all of their operations, which talked about sort of causes of death most broadly. And there were a couple of notable items in those reports, which we wrote about. You can find an article on our website, but we also interviewed Chris Thomas, the Chief Administrative Officer for the Forensic Center, in this week's interview segment. So let's go ahead and go to that. guest this week on the podcast is Chris Thomas, Chief Administrative Officer of the Knox County Regional Forensic Center. And the center published 2 interesting annual reports this week that we're going to talk about. But Chris, first of all, welcome. And I was hoping that for people who may be only sort of vaguely familiar with what the Regional Forensic Center does, if you could just kind of introduce us to your overall operations there, that would be great.
Absolutely. Jesse, thanks for having me on today. So as the Regional Forensic Center, we actually perform 2 separate duties. So we are the official medical examiner's office for Knox and Anderson County, as well as the Forensic Center duties. So all 95 counties have a medical examiner that is appointed by the county mayor. And the medical examiner's job is to certify the deaths of any unnatural, sudden, or unexpected deaths. In addition to that, all 95 counties, if they need autopsy services, they have to choose one of the 5 forensic centers in the state of Tennessee. There's one in Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, Johnson City, and Knoxville. We cover 23 counties in total for autopsy services. So in the counties of Knox and Anderson County, we have a team of investigators. They're called medical legal death investigators, and their jobs are to actually go to the scenes of the death, to write a report, investigate, pull medical records, photograph, be the eyes and the ears for the doctors so they can bring that information back to the center and make a determination if that individual needs to come in for an autopsy or if they can be released to a funeral home. Any natural death where we can document it and there's plenty of medical records, we don't have to bring them in here. They can go on to the funeral home. Most hospitals will report their deaths to us as well, just to make sure that there's not going to be anything that's unexpected that pops up in the medical records that would show anything other than a natural death. And we release those as well too. But obviously the larger portion of our activities and duties here is the autopsy services, and that's where the other counties come in as well too. When a death does need to have an additional investigation and autopsy performed, such as in homicides, drug-related deaths, some suicides and motor vehicle deaths, or just human remains are found somewhere in the region, they have to send it somewhere for an evaluation. So that individual is transferred to our department. Here we perform the autopsy, and we have a team of forensic pathologists. I've got 6 forensic pathologists on staff, and their job is to work with the technicians in performing the actual physical portion of the autopsy here so that they can go through all the internal organs and they can perform histology, toxicology, and review slides, microscopic slides, medical records, and make a determination into what led to that death. We also have to testify in all 23 counties on high-profile homicide cases or motor vehicle cases, anything that has criminal prosecution involved. They usually bring in the medical examiner who performed the autopsy to actually discuss the case and talk about it, what they found. We also handle the anthropology as well, too. So we have an anthropology team. When human remains are found, we send a team out who do the recovery and excavation of those remains. We'll bring those back to our center, and we can actually do a full anthropological evaluation of that individual to look for any kind of trauma, tool marks, things like that that may have been involved in a homicide. That's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what our center does in a daily activity.
And I guess we should mention that we're going to be getting, or you are going to be getting, a new center, right? There was just funding appropriated by the state for a new center that I guess is going to be built over sort of in the Cherokee Farms area.
Well, the original plan was to go to Cherokee Farms, and that land is no longer available to us. So we are in the process of trying to find a new location. I believe we're very close to closing the deal on it, but as it's not an official deal, I can't disclose that location yet. But that will be coming hopefully really soon in a press release as well, too.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that update. I hadn't heard that had changed.
Yeah, well, it was just sort of a last minute thing. I got an email from them that said that they no longer had space for us. So that kind of put us back to the drawing board because I can't really get my plans and everything completed until I get the land situation. But we, for years, go back to 2019, this center, we did 1,971 autopsies and exams. Fast forward 3 years to 21, and that number went from 1971 to 2873. So we had over 1,000 individuals increased during the time of the pandemic with the drug-related epidemic that happened on the back end of the COVID pandemic. And it got to where we were overwhelmed. And if we continue to grow, I would not have space here. I don't have enough space for the employees I got. My administrative assistant works in a records closet. So I went and made a pitch to the governor back in November with Mayor Jacobs' help and our budget director. And we showed them the need for the center and all the counties that we serve. And they were gracious enough to award us funds. So the state's putting in $20 million, the county's putting in $10 million, and we're going to get a nice new facility hopefully in the next couple of years.
Right. Yeah, definitely needed. I mean, if anybody has had the opportunity to visit your center there, you're kind of in an older building, very much landlocked and sort of near West Knoxville, kind of just across Concord Street.
Yes. There. It's a great facility. We have all the tools we need here, but like you said, parking is an issue. So it's hard to get in and out of here. And it was great. The center was built, I think, in a time span of 6 months back in 2014 from a grant that was obtained. It was converted from an old surgical center. So it's met our needs. We just outgrown it.
Well, let's talk about these reports. And these are reports that you issue every year from the center, kind of giving annual summations of your operations and your findings. Sure. And there's both a general report and then a drug-related death report. So, and of course, I think it's important. You mentioned the distinction between natural causes and then the kinds of cases that you all get more directly involved in. The majority of deaths in our area obviously continue to be natural causes, right? It's people dying of disease and various things related to old age and so forth. But in that overall report, kind of setting aside the drug-related deaths for a second, which we will talk about, it looked like, and of course, you're always kind of looking at year-to-year trends, and different things can affect that clearly. And just because you see a jump or a decline from one year to the next doesn't always mean anything in the long run. But there was an increase that you saw in suicide deaths in 2022. Can you just kind of talk about what those numbers showed?
Sure. So, and I always like to state that for an overall year, 2022 was, I'll say, a much better year for us than 2021. The overall number of unnatural, sudden, unexpected deaths declined in Knox County. That just meant that there are a couple areas that anything that had increased stood out a little more. There was an increase in suicides, and the percentage is a scary number, 30%. That's huge. The physical number is not as large when you consider the population of Knox County. I think the number was like 114. But we typically in Knox County have between 80 to 90 suicides per year. So that is a little significant jump percentage-wise as well, too, for the amount of suicide deaths we had seen in the past. I think I've been asked if there was any particular item you could pinpoint, and it is there's a slew of different factors involved in the reason for the rise of suicides. A couple of things that I noticed that were maybe more reoccurring on some of these suicide cases one was obviously domestic arguments between partners, spouses, the loss of a job, basically having an addiction issue uncovered to a loved one that wasn't recently known. There's also, I won't say a larger portion, but a common factor that I see is in individuals, typically older individuals, who have recently received a medical diagnosis that's unfavorable. It could be a terminal illness or just something that is leading them to believe that life will be a burden down the road. And I see that quite often. And because I love the numbers, but if I can't do anything about the numbers, then what's the point? So, I do love that we have plenty of resources. I know there's many different avenues out there individuals can call to try to get help if you're thinking about it. The one thing I would love to see is in the medical professional world is if you're giving someone a diagnosis that could be unfavorable, that there be somebody on hand for mental health counseling and just consultative services to talk to someone about that, not just giving a diagnosis and saying, I'm sorry, but having someone there to talk to them and their family. And I will tell you, I talk to families time and time again. One of the suicides I lost this past year was an old friend of mine. I'm in the military. I was a veteran, and he was a veteran, and unfortunately took his own life. He thought, as I've seen more than one veteran come through here, that it was somebody that I was involved with in my time. And they always seem to think that the family would be better off without them. And I've talked to their families afterwards, and they've all said the same thing. We're not. We're worse off with this. And the family has a really hard time with that stigma of the suicide and being able to move on from there. In other areas of the report, like I said, cardiac natural deaths are always the number one killer. The biggest thing that kills people is our lifestyle and just natural causes. So that's by far and most the greatest cause of death. I'm trying to think of the other areas. Motor vehicle deaths went down. Just accidental deaths went down. Falls is a large number that comes into the annual report. We believe we're a taxpayer-funded organization, so I believe that when you're taxpayer-funded, you have a responsibility to the taxpayers to show what they're getting for that money that they're spending. So that's the biggest reason we create this annual report. Is some people are interested in what we do and some people are not, but I think it's important that we have a transparency as much as we can with the obviously the protection of individual information about what we do, but it's important for the public to know what type of activities go on in this facility since they're paying for it.
Well, and condolences on the loss of your friend. I actually recently lost a friend to suicide as well, and it's really devastating for everybody, obviously. Is there any, I guess, frustration on your all's end, because you're at the very end of the process, obviously. By the time you're seeing cases, everything has already happened. And sometimes in your reports, and we'll talk about the drug-related death report in a second here, because it definitely shows up there, I sometimes get this sense of sort of like trying to wave these big red flags to people, who are engaged early, whether it's medical professionals, family members, therapists, whatever, who are engaged earlier on. And you're kind of trying to say to them, hey, this is what we're seeing. If there's a way for people to intervene when they can still make a difference.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, actually, I'd noticed we had a week of quite a few suicides. And so I reached out to the county mayor's office. That's our hierarchy. And I was like, hey, we've had a lot of suicides this week. And I believe the mayor's office put out some things with the health department. Here's some counseling services available. How's this? I think it was at the early stages of the pandemic. And I just remember that, it became a big political issue about whether or not we were trying to say COVID was or the suicides were COVID related or not. I said, I'm not trying to say anything's related to anything. I'm saying that here's the numbers that's going up. We need some help. It was really sad to see, different areas turning something into a political issue that was basically just a cry for help. Last year, I'll give you a good example of another cry for help that we did. Infants, and nobody likes to talk about baby deaths, but we had we do about 50 to 60 infant autopsies every year. There's a huge misconception out there about the cause of death in most infants. You've probably heard it amongst just people. They use the term like SIDS or unexpected deaths. And that is almost never the case. That happens probably in less than 1% of all the infant deaths that we handle here. Almost every infant death we do is due to unsafe sleep procedures. They're almost all accidental deaths. They're infants that have died either being suffocated, sleeping in a bed with multiple family members, or they're in a crib or a bassinet or a pack and play that has other items in there and they get suffocated. Well, that's a stigma. Nobody wants to come forward and say my child died of suffocation. They say my child died unexpectedly. So there's this big belief that your child may just die all of a sudden. I remember when my kids were little, I would go around and check their breathing in the middle of the night because I was scared to death they would just stop breathing one night. So after being here for a couple of years, and I realized this is the actual issue. So last year we reached out to the health department and Children's Hospital, and there was a media article put out about safe sleep campaign. The state did a full campaign. And when those campaigns came out, we did see the numbers decrease for a little while. And it's gotten better in Knox County. It's gotten a little bit worse this year in our rural counties, which is why I've notified the state again that there's a problem with rural counties and young families not understanding the safe sleep procedures for their infant. They still want to sleep with them in the bed, and everybody's like, "Oh, I slept with my kid in my bed my whole life." I'm sure my kids probably slept in the bed with me. I wasn't aware. I didn't know. And 90% of the time you're fine, but you don't want that 1% of the time. The other thing I beat my head about is regarding the drug-related death report. We actually had the report this year. We talked about xylazine. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I actually had somebody from a medical professional who goes, "Hey, have you all heard about the xylazine?" And I literally about did hit my head because I've been screaming it for 2 years now that this thing was a problem and it was coming. And I've watched the numbers rise since 2021. And this is not the first time that I've warned people about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's jump into that drug-related death report, because that is obviously a major focus locally, statewide, nationally, in terms of policy, intervention, people trying but we're continuing, despite all the focus and attention, we are continuing to see numbers go up. I mean, we're at historic levels. It seems like year after year after year. It's just sort of like one record number after another. So this year the numbers did go up, but I guess the good news, if you can call it that, is that they didn't go up very much, right?
So yeah, this is the flip side of my reasoning on suicides. I said suicide had a scary percentage, but a low number. Drug-related deaths have a low percentage, but a huge number. So it's okay. It only went up 2%. That's fine, but that's 544 drug-related deaths. Now you go back just a few years ago, we had a 5-year decline in the drug-related deaths until 2019. In 2019, it was 293 drug-related deaths. So from 2019 to 293 to now at 544, that's a problem. It's not working. It's getting worse. The first quarter for this year, our estimates are that it's going to be even higher. But then again, even the DA has released a report. We've had a, knock on wood, calmer summer than expected. So I don't know how this end of the year is going to work out. I really pray. I think somebody said it here one time when I used to say each month, like, here's a new record, here's a new record. And one of the doctors says, I'm tired of winning. Mm-hmm. If that's what it's considered, I'm tired of these new records. I don't want to set any more new records. I want to set some low records. So yeah, the drug-related death continues to be a problem here in Knox County. The amount of fentanyl that flows through Knox County, we have this intersection 4075, and the drugs just come through here. I'm not law enforcement, but I understand, most everything comes from Michigan is what they're telling us. But xylazine is the sort of the kind of go-to. For the last 4 or 5 years, we talked about fentanyl and fentanyl analytes, and that's definitely still the largest problem. I've got 544 deaths, and over 400 of them contain fentanyl. So, that's obviously the largest problem we have. It used to be 2 years ago when I lost a cousin, also through a drug-related death, and she was a known heroin user, but there was no heroin or toxicology. It was just fentanyl. So for a while, people were just giving them fentanyl instead of heroin, and they were overdosing and died. Well, now people have learned that fentanyl is, the high that they want. So now they're asking for fentanyl. And then they're getting Narcan, and they're getting revived, and they're getting mad about being revived. I've actually heard stories where people were upset that they got revived. So now they have found this new product, xylazine. So to give you an example of how fast this has came into the market, and I track every one of these cases, the very first case we ever saw was in 2018 in December with one case of xylazine. The next year in 2019, we saw 5 cases. Once again, not a big on the radar. But in 2020, we had 20 cases. So it went from 5 to 20. So it quadrupled in a year. That was a little disconcerting. And that's when I think at the end of 2020 is when we started raising our hand a little bit, said, there's a horse tranquilizer that's mixed in more deaths. And then 2021, that number jumped to like 44 deaths. And I said, okay, we have a much larger problem. Last year, I think it was, what was my total numbers? Around 70 something deaths. Mm-hmm. So I've already seen over 60 deaths this year in Knox County related to xylazine. We're going to have triple digit numbers this year. And it's a sedative. It's a tranquilizer. It's meant for animals, but apparently it's so readily available that you can get it and cut it and mix it with your fentanyl. And the other side of that is it's Narcan resistant. It's not an opioid. Narcan is an opioid antagonist. So when you give someone Narcan, it reverses the effects of opioids. But xylazine is not an opioid, so Narcan won't work on it. Now, the medical professionals, and I still agree, you should always, Narcan someone because you don't necessarily know what's in their system. However, this number, I pray that they keep just cutting it with it, and this doesn't become a replacement. People don't just start taking straight up xylazine without fentanyl or methamphetamine mix, because that's obviously just a recipe for death. And I don't want something else to replace fentanyl as the number one drug. But this drug now has made its way not only barely on the radar to a watch list, but now it is the 5th most common drug that is directly involved in the death of drug-related deaths in Knox County. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem.
Well, one of the data points that you all point out in the report is the age distribution of drug-related deaths in Knox County, and obviously the group that continues to be hardest hit, the 35 to 44 age group, and that you can kind of see that making sense. But one of the things I noticed when looking at this is the 45 to 54 and the 55 to 64 year age groups are pretty close behind. It's not. They're significantly higher than the people in their 20s, and so
you're absolutely right.
Talk about that a little bit. I mean, I don't think that a lot of people associate drug overdoses with people who are approaching Medicare.
Yeah, no, I've had plus 75 drug-related deaths in the cocaine and methamphetamine intoxication. But yeah, I'll say that 35 and up group, and I think it was if you go back to my drug-related death report of 2020, the numbers doubled for those 55 and up of what had previously been. So you're absolutely right. There is a larger portion of those over 55 individuals that are still overdosing on drugs. And if there's probably a lot of different perceptions on why that may be. Someone had told me once this was your Woodstock generation that used to take in, recreational drugs, and now their recreational drugs are getting mixed with the stronger, potent substances such as fentanyl. These are people who had taken LSD and they had smoked marijuana, but now that they're getting something with a little bit stronger of a kick to it, and their bodies just can't handle it. I know we also have there's a large portion of the homeless population that we find here. I know we used to have like certain areas inside Knoxville where we called the homeless camps, and it wasn't uncommon for us to go there occasionally and remove someone that had passed away from a drug-related fatality. But I know they broke up some of those camps, and now they're just in multiple places in the city and the county. So we're finding some of these older individuals just in random places, usually around some of the facilities where they can go to, the Carms and the Restoration House and places like that that'll give them shelter and food and clothing every now and then, but we'll find them in tents behind their facilities. But you're absolutely right. It's not something you would have thought that the 55 to 75, the group over 75 this year went down quite a bit. I think there might have only been just like one or two. But in the past, we've had 5, 6, 7 individuals over 75. And there's also, as a medical examiner, we can subpoena and gather medical records from anywhere in the state to help determine the cause and manner of death. However, there is a clause inside that state law that does not allow us to access substance abuse records and mental health records. We have actually been trying to fight this law for a couple of years now, and I've got a couple of different senators that are trying to help me with some legislation, because it does mean that I believe that our suicide deaths are underreported. Because in the drug-related deaths, unless there's a note or just obviously you should see an entire bag full of a particular pill or something. I have no way of knowing what their intent was. I don't know what their tolerance level is. I don't know what their user history is. So if I got somebody who takes, say 2 cc's of heroin or something like that, and all of a sudden they're taking 10 cc's of heroin, to me, that's, they had a intent. They were not just trying to take drugs. They were trying to kill themselves. But I don't know their history. So we wonder, too, especially in some of these older individuals or even in the younger individuals, if they were taking the amount they took with the intention of killing themselves. But we don't know. They're just all labeled as accidental. Very few drug-related deaths are able to be labeled as suicide because we don't have access to those records.
Well, and just wanted to mention, you're talking about age groups, and even though there is a concentration of those deaths in the older age groups, 35 and up, the age group that you saw the actual biggest increase year over year was the 25 to 34, right?
Yeah, the percentage of increase was in that group there, which was it was actually, I think, the 14 to 24, which was just a little disconcerting because that younger age group has typically not been on the radar, which makes you believe that the education level is increasing as far as the awareness of what drugs do to you and not getting addicted at an earlier age. But we did see that 15 to 24-year-old spike. And once again, the numbers were lower. Obviously, they're lower than the rest of them. But it just increased more than what we've seen in quite a few years, probably since about 2017 was the largest time we've seen this increase in that age group, which concerns me about younger individuals. We've talked about the Metro Drug Coalition. They taught something called about ACE receptors. You have events in your life, and basically these different events, they gave like a point system to it, whether it's divorced parents, whether it's being abused as a child. And the larger your point spectrum is, they believe that the larger the possibility is of you becoming addicted to substances later in life. I can't tell you how many of these cases I see where we do have a drug-related fatality where the body is found by their minor children. So, in the back of my mind, I'm sitting there thinking these ACE receptors, I'm like, we are in the process of starting what 10 years from now is going to be a much larger epidemic because of the trauma inflicted on these children. And I'm afraid if they don't get the right education and the right family environment, they're going to end up on the same path as their parents were. Because I have seen time and time again where we've connected cases where we've buried a parent of and a child have died of the same manner, 5-7 years apart, especially in those, 35-year-old time frames. Their kids become 20s and they end up on drugs themselves. So you wonder, I worry about that if we're starting to get into that phase from years past, because I've only been here a little over 4 years, so I know how far back I've seen it go, but I can't imagine even the years prior to that how far it's begun in that process. So I'm hoping we're not seeing a new trend. But I do agree that more education needs to be out there. My daughter's a sophomore in college, and last year when she went there for freshman year, and I told her, I said, don't even borrow a Tylenol. Mm-hmm. I said, you don't take it. Don't have an open cup around anybody. You take your own pills, your own Tylenol, your own ibuprofen. Don't give anyone any pills. And if you need a pill, you get your own. Don't ask a friend, because I've talked to several fathers who have given me the stories of my kid just had a back hurt. A friend of him gave him Xanax, and it turned out it was laced with fentanyl, and he died. Yeah,
that I have to say, as a parent of teenagers myself, the strongest drug talks that I've had with my kids are pills and powders. Just like pills and powders, you don't know what they are. Just
stay away.
It doesn't matter what anyone tells you. Well, there's a ton here. Obviously, we could talk about, but these reports are on your website, I believe. People can go there and read them. And thanks very much for helping to shed a little bit of light on this for us. We really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, and thanks again to Chris Thomas for talking with us. We appreciate it. We are now to the Q&A part of the podcast, where every week we go on our subscriber-only Facebook page, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you're a subscriber, which you can become by going to CompassKnox.com and signing up for your subscription. And we ask our readers if there's anything in particular they would like to hear talked about on the podcast beyond the obvious headlines. We had a couple of questions this week, and one that I thought we could probably handle here is What is the future of the free downtown trolley system operated by Knoxville Area Transit, Scott?
Well, it's not completely determined yet, is the short answer. The just last Thursday, the Knoxville Transportation Authority approved the new bus network that Knoxville Area Transit, CAT, has put together with a lot of public input and research and all that over a public process over the last couple of years. It kind of is under the CAT Reimagined moniker. It is they kind of they changed a bunch of routes. Some they made are going to be more frequent. Some areas aren't going to get as much coverage. And, kind of finding that balance between ridership and areas covered, because basically the more larger the geographic area you cover, the lower your ridership's going to be. The more riders you take care of, the smaller the geographic footprint's going to be. Is the shorthand version of the balance that they need to strike. And KTA approved the new network on Thursday on a unanimous vote. It will start going into effect basically next year. Get into that in just a second. The question came up was, are the trolleys disappearing? And the answer is kind of, sort of, maybe. What's happening is the routes will definitely change. The trolleys are free. There are 4 routes downtown area and out to UT. The UT route will be eliminated. You'll be able to get to UT from downtown by bus, but not by trolley anymore.
The trolley had been going all the way out to University Commons and the Publix grocery store there, right? Right.
And so now that route will be eliminated no matter what. The route, they're renaming this the Downtown Connector, so it's not really the trolley route. Downtown Connector, and it will run from the map. It will run from the Austin at First Creek, the redeveloped Austin Homes area, up by the Civic Coliseum to downtown, through downtown, out to Regas Square, and then back again. And that's going to be basically the route, and be the route, not multiple routes.
And it'll still be free?
Well, they haven't figured that out yet.
Uh-huh.
That's still to be determined. It's still to be determined whether it's going to be free. One of the other things they are leaning toward replacing the trolleys, the faux streetcar vehicles that they use now, and just use electric buses. But they haven't determined yet about a fare, if there is going to be a fare, if so, how much it's going to be, those kinds of things. Those still need to be worked out. So while the network is in place, there's still a lot of changes that can happen. I mean, one of the changes that could happen, and they almost certainly will, is when they get down to determining where each individual bus stop is.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that will require, for whatever reason, a route to move over a block or 2 blocks or something like that, where so the route will have to take a detour from what's on the map now to actually accommodate that. So there are changes that are going to be made, in some of the adjustments, the tweaks, would be things like whether the Downtown Connector will have a charge, and what exactly what the vehicles are actually going to be. And
right, so there's definitely a chance that whatever happens, we are not going to have the actual little trolleys that have been a part of the downtown landscape for the last, 15 years or however long.
Oh, it's been longer than that, I believe. But yes, that is the little, like I said, the faux streetcar, that we have, little red things that and they're cute, and they would be replaced in one scenario by electric buses. Now that doesn't. I talked to Tommy Smith, who's a city council member, who's on the KTA board. He said that is something that they're still discussing, and that they will talk about it at some point in the future. One other thing that's kind of not mentioned in there that has been discussed, and I don't know, it's really more of a special use service, much like UT Game Day thinks is the baseball stadium or the special use stadium that's being built in the old city. I know they've talked about having greater service on game days there. That is so far in the future, though. I think that's they're going to want to get the whole network done first, and then we'll probably worry about shuttling people to and from the multi-use stadium. And this is going to be phased in over time. This is going to be not going to be until next year that these that the routes will actually change. They've got a lot of education to do. I mean, there's still a lot of people who don't really realize that they're doing this or what it actually means, and how that could change their commutes. That's one of the big things, and this is kind of one of the things about the trolleys is that CAT is looking at this as essentially we need to get people who don't have vehicles from their homes to their jobs and back, and that's a big part of what they do. The trolleys is a little, I'm sure there are people who live downtown who go from their condos or apartments to another part of downtown where they work, their office building is, but primarily it's more of a convenience transportation.
Right. I mean, if you are able-bodied, you can cover the entirety of the downtown, apart from that stretch going out Cumberland. Yeah. But the downtown trolley service area, in about 15 minutes on foot.
Yeah, and you got scooters too.
Mm-hmm. And there are scooters.
But I mean, but it's generally to get around downtown, not necessarily to commute to work, and that is really a much bigger focus for the network as a whole. The trolley is a very small, highly visible, and very popular, but very small part of the network as a whole.
And an expensive one inherently because it has no revenue.
Yeah, that's true. It does not generate revenue.
Right. So. Well, as somebody who has very rarely taken a trolley but always enjoys seeing them around town, I would certainly miss them as just sort of like atmospheric or, they're a pleasant part of the landscape, but I understand that these are not aesthetic decisions at the base. They're going to be financial decisions.
I'm much lazier than you are. I'll probably miss them a little bit, but actually I don't use them very often anymore. A lot of times it's one of those things that I've ridden them as often as kind of the novelty of riding them as much as it's been to get from one place or another, because it is kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, the times I've been on them has most often been because I'm downtown with my kids when they were smaller, and they'd be like, let's get on the trolley. And so, they're nice to ride and everything. And for some people, I think they are very important to getting around downtown. And again, especially people with any kind of physical disabilities and so forth. So not to denigrate their utility in any way. No. As you say, it's a small part of a much bigger picture that they're trying to put together. Okay, well, let's look ahead to this coming week. We do have a couple of things on the calendar. We talked about the judicial candidate forum last week. There's another forum coming up this week, Tuesday, August 1st at 6:30. The mayoral candidates will be gathering at the Public Works Service Center at 3131 Morris Avenue. I will be moderating this one. Scott will be in attendance. So in addition to the 4 mayoral candidates who, as far as I know, are all supposed to have committed to showing up there. You can come and see both of us. So, kind of a little bonus, but yeah, it'll be a good opportunity, presumably, to hear from Mayor India Kincannon and her challengers, Jeff Tallman, Constance Every, and R.C. Lawhorn. And then, Scott, later in the week, City Council and County Commission are holding a joint workshop.
Yeah, they're holding a joint workshop on mental health issues. They've invited the state delegation, the legislative delegation, to attend as well. It's very similar to one they've held in the past to talk about kind of the mental health landscape in Knoxville and Knox County. Part of there are a couple of things here. Part of it is the county commission has already asked the state to build a mental health hospital here, basically to replace Lakeshore, which closed 11 years ago now, I guess, and the Lakeshore Mental Health Institute, and which a lot of people have pointed to as the time when things like people with mental illness being out living on the streets and things like that, and and we should say the data, that's it's a popular narrative around here that we got a lot more homeless people on our streets when Lakeshore closed. The data doesn't really bear that out. Part of the reason for that is that by the time Lakeshore closed in 2012, it actually had very few beds in it. There were only, I think, a couple of dozen people there on a regular basis. And so if you look at over time, the closing of Lakeshore and then the local homeless population, which I've gone back and tried to analyze in the past, and there's not any clear connection between those things. At the same time, I think most people agree that broadly, nationally, the move toward deinstitutionalization starting in the 1970s was a contributing factor, along with rising housing costs and a lot of other things. Well, it's also undeniable that a substantial number of people who are without housing have mental health issues.
Right.
I mean, that's,
whether those are issues that would actually lead to institutionalization and so forth. Yeah. Like that's a whole other discussion. But,
but anyway, it grew out of that. It also has grown out of the move on city council led by Councilwoman Amelia Parker to establish an alternative response program. We've talked about that on the podcast before. Her colleagues on the council, while generally supportive of the concept, want to make sure that whatever they do is placed into the context of the overall mental health treatment constellation of Knoxville. So that's kind of how we got to this point. And so they are going to have a public joint meeting, I believe it's the 3rd at
5 p.m. in the main assembly room Thursday, the City County building. And so we will be covering all of those, writing about those next week, and we will be back here next week to talk about that and anything else that happens in the interim. And any UFOs that happen to land, we will be there to cover it. Right. Maybe one of us will get abducted.
Ooh. Take me, please. Kidding.
You're just trying to get out of covering this city primary. All right, well, that'll do it for this week. Thanks, as always, to our producer, Lord Seth Barber at Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. And for those of you with school-age kids, this coming week is the last week of summer vacation, so enjoy it.
And one more thing. Monday's the last day to register to vote, so if you haven't voted, if you haven't registered to vote, Monday's your last chance, or then, paying attention to the mayor's race and the city council races is kind of an academic exercise.
Right. So. All right. We'll talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.